Were Homer and the tragic myths considered history? How were they able to revere goddesses, but not the average woman? And what exactly did the ancients find taboo in Euripides' controversial work? Hint, it's not what we would be offended by today. Hello, this is Anya Leonard, founder and director of Classical Wisdom. You are listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today I'm speaking with an old friend and our resident classicist, Ben Potter, on Homer and the ancient Greek tragedians. But before we begin, a quick thank you to our Classical Wisdom Society members who make this podcast possible. If you would like to become a society member and help support the classics, please go to classicalwisdom.com and click Start Here. Now on to the Greek foundational myths and the role of theater in the ancient world. We are going to try to cover both Homer and the Tragedians. In the past, we often get so into Homer that we end up being a bit short on time for the Tragedians, so I'm going to try to watch the clock and navigate us through so that we can really cover a broader range. But maybe to start off with, we can do one that sort of covers the whole genre, is to what extent would a Greek audience have considered Homer and the tragic plays to be history?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, and it's one that's sort of, the answer is almost impossible because it's a comparative question for the modern world might be something like, to what extent would a country like France or the UK or the United States consider the Bible history? And
Depends on who you ask.
It depends. Yeah, it will depend largely on who you ask. I think probably it's more in history. There are more people who believed it was actual history than people believe the Bible is history today. Although, I mean, huge parts of the Bible are definitely set in historical settings. It's just we're arguing about the details that happen within them. So, of course, we know Pilate was the governor of Judea and things like this. So we know we are dealing with a historical setting. The Greeks definitely saw the age that came before them or the ages that came before them of the ages of the great heroes. And they're talking about the heroes before the heroes of Homer, who are people like Jason and Hercules, Heracles, and all these sorts of people. And then you've got the Homeric characters, and they did. It seems that they did think that they were real people. I'm sure they had this feeling that there was a pinch of salt within them, like Heracles really went here and really did this, and my civilization, I'm Athenian, and my people are really the people of Theseus and things like this. There's probably a pinch of salt here and there. I might say, having been born in England, I can talk about King Arthur, and we don't really know anything about King Arthur, if he was a real person or not. Probably was a real person, but all the stories we have about him, we're extremely dubious about. So I would imagine it's something along these lines. But as a cultural navigation point, it was absolutely crucial. That's why I would compare it to something like the holy books in whatever culture you're brought up in, because everything you say, every reference you make, all the phrases you use, if you're cursing and you say and you use Jesus' name or God's name, you are harking back to your Christian, Jewish heritage or whatever heritage you have. So it was totally ubiquitous in society in the same way that Christianity is ubiquitous in European, North American, South American society. So it's like you say, it depends on I would imagine it depended very much on the individual, whether whether they saw these characters as real people from a real part of history.
And I guess not all of those characters would be equal, though. I mean, like, maybe more people thought Agamemnon existed than, say, Oedipus. Or, I mean, would they have been kind of all in the same genre, or are there some that were felt to be more historically based than others?
Well, it did change over the years. There was towards the end of the 6th century BC in Athens, there was quite a big obsession with the hero cult. So this is when people started to be very interested in heroes, like Odysseus and like Heracles. And in fact, when
they would have loved the Mariah Carey song, right?
We put a few minutes of that on, just to have a bit of filler of Mariah. And in fact, when the tyrant Pisistratus came into Athens to seize power, he did it with trying to present himself sort of in the guise of Heracles. So there was this nod towards these heroes. So I would imagine King Arthur might be quite a good comparison to make in terms of what an Anglo-Saxon might feel about King Arthur, that the Greeks might have felt about some of these heroes. It's probably what those heroes represent is probably much stronger than where they were placed in history. Because you say we're the brave people, we're the descendants of Hercules. We're the cunning people, we're the Ithacans, that sort of thing. We're the descendants of Odysseus. So they definitely tapped into everybody's culture, and they tapped in, and they were at the forefront of people's minds. The fact that they were together with gods in all their stories, the gods were definitely, for some people, taken extremely seriously. And if you transgress the gods, it's not just bad manners, it's a case of blasphemy, and you can be in serious trouble, and you can be executed very often for this. So in these stories, the gods would take huge precedence. But I don't think I ever heard of anybody being executed or imprisoned for saying, "Oh, I don't really believe in Heracles," or "Odysseus wasn't really such an important guy." But if you start to say the things about the gods, then you're pushing it a bit.
That's amazing. That the ferventness to the gods and the goddesses. And I guess, speaking of which, to kind of delve into the specifics of the Odyssey, the goddesses were so revered, and as you said, it was very important. And of course, the goddesses that are in the Odyssey are, Athena herself is such an essential character. So how does that sort of square with how women were treated when goddesses are so crucial? How, therefore, would life have been for, the Penelopes and the Clytemnestras and all the female characters?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit difficult talking about the Greek world because we're covering many centuries, and we're covering many geographical points which are quite distinct. We sort of think of Greece. If you've been to Greece today, it's a country. It's quite a distinct country with a culture, and wherever you are, you're in Greece. But back then, you could be in Sparta, you could be in Argos, you could be in Athens, and you might actually see quite strong differences in culture. In terms of time, from what we can work out, we go from thinking about when the Trojan War might have been was perhaps 1200 BC, not really so clear. We come back, and it could have been during the Dark Ages, about 1000 BC. And during this time, this Dark Age time in Greece, it's called the Dark Ages because we lose literature, we lose writing. It doesn't mean that everything was terrible, particularly. We lose writing, and people stop trading with each other as well, which is one reason we lose writing, because people are not keeping records of things anymore. So
why did they stop trading?
It was a breakdown of the Mycenaean civilization on the island of Crete, which is probably one of the most believable theories, that there was probably a huge tsunami from a volcanic eruption on Santorini.
The Theron eruption.
Yeah, so it was ancient Thera caused a volcanic eruption and a tsunami, and might have wiped out civilizations in this way. It might have been directly the earthquake itself, which toppled the civilizations. You didn't need that many people to die to lose literature in those days. You just needed the palace scribes, probably mostly, and you'd be losing most people who knew how to read and write.
That's a good point.
And it just seemed to wide scale trading seemed to break down for this dark age time. But as far as we can understand, in this dark age time, it seems women might have been treated quite a lot better than they were later on, for example, during Athenian democracy. And we sort of have this idea of Athens in the 5th century BC, and we think about, well, it's democratic. And in our mind, we sort of associate democracy with being more civilized. It's a given, which is not necessarily true. But it's democratic, and it's full of the richest art and literature we have from that time. That's when the Parthenon gets built. That's when all of the plays that we
golden age, yeah,
it's an absolute golden age of Greek culture. It's the classical age of Athens. So we look to Athens, and we look to the 5th century, and this is actually a lousy time to be a woman. It's you don't if you're a normal woman, you go about, you're quite free. It's quite good if you're a lower class woman. You go to the agora, you go and
I like how
sell
lower
your
class women are just normal women, by the way.
yeah.
Those normal women, yeah.
You're still lacking in agency. You still are not an independent person. You're still sort of point eight of a person. You're not a slave, but you are subject to your kyrios, to your father, your brother, your husband. If your husband dies, you probably have to go back and be looked after by your brother. You can't really disobey them that well, certainly not so openly. So it is strange that the original question you were asking about, how can we have all this veneration and this amazing veneration of women, and in the Odyssey, Penelope is such an important figure, and she's the only perfect character in the Odyssey. She's the only person who, even Odysseus, we can constantly say, what, he's behaving badly all through it. Athena is this incredibly powerful, incredibly important person who pushes Odysseus on to success. He's aided on his way in part by Circe, but quite a lot by Calypso, who people say that she detains him. I think he detains himself for quite a long time on Calypso's island, having a nice romance for all these years, while his wife and child are suffering at home. And then how can we have all these powerful female figures and then have a mediocre existence, or a very bad existence, for most women in classical Athens? And it's I mean, we don't apply the same rules to gods as we apply to people. We don't apply the same rules to these sorts of characters as we apply to each other. And I think we probably still recognize that a little bit. We still have the expression, do what I say, not what I do, a little bit.
But I think your point too is that, I think an incorrect understanding of history is that, like, we started down here and then, like, we're always progressing in this straight line, and like now we're better than them then. And when reality, things are constantly flowing, and that Penelope isn't a goddess, and yet she is treated with such respect by the author and by the people in the book. You know what I mean? That makes me think that, yes, the archaic period of ancient Greece, women had more respect than they do in the classical time period. And even when Odysseus is in the island, the Phoenicians, I think, and he goes directly to the queen rather than the king. Like, he has to show respect to the queen. Like she's held in such high regard.
That's right.
That
And
I do. Yeah, go ahead.
sorry, so yes, you're absolutely right. He washes up on the shore where he meets the princess Nausicaa, and she gives him the advice: when you come to the palace, go to mum, don't go to dad.
Yeah,
Go to the
yeah, yeah.
queen. Wrap your arms around her legs and beg her to help you. And he does that. Once he's got the queen's favor, then everything's pretty smooth for Odysseus after that. So and this seems to be the thing about Ithaca as well, about his own household, his own oikos, is that Penelope seems to be, she's not just queen, she's kingmaker. It seems to be
Mhm.
whoever Penelope recognizes will hold the power.
Well, and you think in more traditional societies, matrilineal attendance structures make more sense because that's the only way you can guarantee that, pre-DNA tests, that
Mm.
the rightful lineage is being respected is from the mom, So I do think that there is a tendency in the ancient Greek world, but, again, you see history sort of repeat itself in Judeo-Christianity and things like that, that you sort of revere the Mother Earth, you revere the goddesses, you revere fertility, and then, once sort of the women have too much power, then, somebody wants to come along and take it away.
Yeah, I mean, if you a modern comparison, which hopefully doesn't upset too many people, might be Catholicism, and Catholicism is absolutely obsessed with the Madonna figure.
Mhm.
But there are plenty of countries where you wouldn't say that they are matriarchal in any way. Plenty of Catholic countries, and there's quite some Catholic countries which you might say are quite misogynistic, despite this amazing reverence for the Madonna. So
Mhm.
it's this could be an idea of if you have someone like Penelope or Athena or any perfect character like this, you make the bar so high for what it means to be a woman that
Mhm.
it's impossible to reach. And you could say this is the equivalent for modern times, about how so many Catholic countries have this very huge obsession with venerating the Virgin Mary. Even it seems if you walk around southern Spain or southern Italy, you might actually think it's that they worship Virgin Mary more than they worship Christ, because she's on every corner.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in a country right now in Argentina where, yeah, you see statues for like the Virgin, in many places, like as like the sort of main focal point. And we also have a horrible rate of femicide and that sort of thing. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's a good, excellent point. Maybe to sort of bring us back to the Odyssey, since I know you and I could talk about just about any subject for a while. Why, like, and speaking of Penelope specifically, why are the suitors so patient? Why don't they just kill Telemachus? And does Penelope wait for Odysseus? Like, why does she wait?
Yeah, so Odysseus goes off to the Trojan War. He fights there for 10 years and takes another 10 years to get back. So the suitors, I mean, why are they so patient? They're not going to, they don't make a move for the first 10 years because they know the war's going on. Presumably there are messengers coming back from Troy, and they know, okay, the war's going on, fine. The war ends and they're waiting, and they're thinking, well, okay, so presumably Odysseus is going to be here one of these days, going to be one of these days soon. Maybe a messenger arrives and says, oh, we spotted him here, we heard this rumor he was there. And the biggest reason they're patient is because you don't want to get that call wrong. You don't want to say, okay, this is not coming back. Come on, let's force Penelope to marry one of us, and one of us can be the king. And then Odysseus arrives the next day. That's not going to end well for whoever's made that move.
So,
So
waiting also didn't end well for them.
that's true. That's true. Well, they actually, and the other reason that they were patient, I mean, one reason is because being cynical, you might say, because they were scared of what Odysseus would do should he come back. They might also have been respectful for the traditions, for the say, she's the queen, he's the king, it's not my place to do anything about it. And it's maybe only once society starts to degrade and fall to pieces because of a lack of leadership that they start to say something needs to be done. And it takes them 7 years from the end of the Trojan War. So they are pretty patient until they start to say to Penelope, you need to remarry, we need to move our community forwards, because we've had no king for 7 years. And that's when she starts to do her, when she does her trick, and she says, oh, of course, I understand, I need to marry one of you. So as soon as I've woven this burial shroud for my father-in-law, sorry, for Odysseus's father, who is still alive. I always found that a strange thing to say. I'm going to weave this burial shroud. I can imagine Laertes standing in the corner going, alive? Excuse me, excuse me.
Hi. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, I know what you think about me now.
Yeah. So that's only after 7 years she starts that trick of weaving it every day and unweaving it every night. And then they catch her at it, and then she's forced into the situation where she basically needs to choose one of them. And that's when she sets the bow contest. So they are patient for a while, probably out of either respect or out of good sense. But then they're not patient anymore. Then they say, okay, come on, let's get on with it. Let's marry someone. And that's where we come in.
But so if they're patient enough to, out of respect, out of fear, tradition, or things like that, then why are they not respectful of the household in regards to like eating everything and taking the resources? Like, I mean, if you were so fearful of him or respectful in either way, like, why would you not think that he wasn't gonna get pissed off for you eating all of his food? You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, this is what makes them villains. This is what makes Odysseus's behavior justified when he comes back and massacres them. He doesn't shoo them away. He doesn't say, okay, I'm here, I'm the king, go away, everybody, go home. They all need to die because they have committed this terrible, terrible sin against Xenia, against the laws of hospitality. So this is why they've all got to go, because this is unforgivably bad guest behavior of coming to somebody's house and besieging it and using up all of their resources in a completely unreasonable way, and raping their maidservants and terrorizing the family. And when we come in the Odyssey, plotting to kill the son of the household who's going to come of age soon. So this is why they all need to go. So I don't know why they have the flick between the patience and the terrible behavior. I would imagine it's probably because they all believe Odysseus is dead, so they think, okay, now we're safe. Now we can behave badly, and we're gonna. If Penelope's not going to move on, then we're just going to have 3 years of partying and steal from you, basically, until you read your mind.
It's really terrifying to think what happens if you're a bad guest, everybody. Just so you know, don't bring a gift. Yeah, be polite. Don't eat too much,
And be a good host as well. You've got to be a good host as well. Somebody comes, you've got to sit them down, you've got to feed them, give them something to drink. Don't ask them any questions until they are rested and satisfied, and then you can ask them questions. So it works both ways.
Okay, here's our last question coming for regards to the Homer section. What do you make of the depictions of Agamemnon and Achilles in Hades in Odyssey Book 11?
In the Nicaea, the Book of the Dead, yes. This is the Nicaea. I often say to people who are new to Homer, what should I read? Should I just open up the Iliad? I say, no, open up Book 11 of the Odyssey. And this is a nice place to enter from, because it's totally self-contained little chapter, and it's very interesting. And it's Odysseus is sent into Hades by Circe, and is told he needs to go down there to talk to the blind prophet Tiresias. And when he's there, and it's lovely for Homer to write this, or whoever wrote it, to do a great sort of who's who, greatest hits of all the heroes, and we see this hero and this hero, and we see great images we have of people in hell, people like Tantalus trying to stoop down to drink the water, and the water disappears, and reach his hand up to get a piece of fruit from the tree, and the fruit sort of yanks up like it's on a piece of string, and Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill eternally, and it rolls down. He's got to do it again. So it's this wonderful moment where we can do a real greatest hits of all of these
People who are
characters
getting
from
tortured.
people who've been tortured.
Yeah. Woohoo! It's not so
But
much fun. Look, he's being tortured there. He's being tortured there.
but we've got a wrong idea from the West of what Hades is. Hades is not. It's not our hell. You have Tartarus, which is the worst part of Hades, where all of these terrible things are happening, where people are having their livers pecked out, where people are being tortured for all eternity. And then there's just the normal part of Hades, where, like the questioner asked, where Odysseus meets Agamemnon and meets Achilles. And the two really interesting moments in the book. And the reason he meets Agamemnon is to glorify Penelope. That's the whole point of him meeting Agamemnon, because of course Agamemnon's come back from the war and he's immediately been murdered by his wife and her new lover, by Clytemnestra and Aegisthus. And I'm sure we'll talk about the House of Atreus when we talk about theatre. And he's there, Agamemnon's there to say to Odysseus, beware of bad wives, beware of bad women. I mean, and he says, oh, I'm sure Penelope would never do anything like that, but be careful. So he says these sort of two things in the same breath. And that's the whole point of this. And we're constantly getting these comparisons. We got this one to Clytemnestra. Through the whole epic, we're getting comparisons to Helen. And Penelope's always been compared to Helen. And Helen, of course, the cause of the war in the first place. Well, you could say Paris, but people say Helen was the cause of the war in the first place when she ran off to Troy with Paris. And that's the great
She didn't
reason.
have a choice in that, by the way, though. I mean, wasn't she like struck by, Cupid's arrow and stuff like that? Like,
yeah, there's this weird. There are these sort of very strange moments that run all through Greek mythology of, if the gods have forced you to do something, of course that's not your fault. But if you have committed a sin, you're still responsible for that sin. So even if you are not responsible for the action, you're still responsible for the sin. Oedipus is a good example. I mean, he doesn't want to marry his mother. In fact, he's going out of his way to not kill his father. He's been told that he'll do that. So that's why he goes away, and it ends up, of course, killing his father and marrying his mother. He tries to escape his fate. So even though he's not at fault for his fate, he's still at fault for his sin. It's a very
is that like a way to sort of square the circle of just injustice that exists in the world, that you're like, well, you're still held responsible for things that you don't have control over?
Yeah, well, this is a big part of the tragedians from Athens. They're always in all of them. They're always talking about how your fate is your fate, and how you react, how you accept your fate, is the mark of who you are. And you can't make anything better, but if you don't accept your fate, well, you can make things worse.
Yeah, I guess that's sort of like the tenets of Stoicism. Like, you have to accept things that are outside of your control, but you only have control in your reactions to how you respond to things, which is a pretty helpful way to think about things, really.
Very helpful way to think about. If you can, it's much easier to think about that after you've already done something to screw things up for yourself. It's like, I should have thought about that while I was doing that, while I was reacting badly. So it's a good message to keep reminding yourself.
Maybe speak for yourself for that one.
I was.
It is a handy tactic. So it's interesting just to see how in the ancient world that I think they're more aware of things being outside of your control. I suppose nowadays we like to think that we're in charge of ourselves
Mm.
more. It's part of our culture, you know, like even you
Yeah.
can be president or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Like, no, not me. I couldn't
Uh,
have.
yeah. No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So where are we? Oh yes, we're in the underworld, and
Yes.
so this is the point of coming across Agamemnon and seeing Achilles. Seeing Achilles is a really interesting moment because some people have used this moment of when Odysseus meets Achilles as the proof that the Iliad and the Odyssey were written by different people. I mean, they may well have been written by different people, but I don't see this moment as proof of that, because when he talks to Achilles, proud, bold Achilles, Achilles who was given the choice as a young man, do you want to die the greatest hero in Greek history, or do you want to die old, happy, anonymous, surrounded by your family? And he chooses young death and glory, and he seeks it out wherever he can.
Mm.
And the Achilles in the underworld that Odysseus speaks to, he says, I would rather be a peasant working on the land up
He
above,
regrets it.
yeah, than be the king of all the dead. So even though I'm the most famous dead person down here, I would rather be nobody on the earth. So I mean, there's a lot of talk. Does he regret it? Is this a lot of bull? Is he feeding us some nonsense? You say, no, yeah, that's not right, Achilles. Or is this Homer saying this is how bad death is? That life,
Choose
even
life.
a lousy life, is better than this. So it's a debate, but it's a very interesting. No character changes more than Achilles does, I would say, between the two epics.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's a certain amount of naturalness to that. Like, you know, you can ask an 18-year-old like going off to war if they think that this is the most important thing, and you know, ask them again when they're in their 60s if they thought that they felt the same at that same time. You know what I mean? Like, even as an individual, it seems supernatural that somebody, the choice that they would make as an 18-year-old and the choice they would make as a 60-year-old would be very different. And you see
Yeah,
that all the time. I mean, 18-year-olds are often incredibly stupid about making choices with regards to their mortality, and they make choices that could kill them. And if they
yeah.
manage to survive them when they're older, they would not make those same choices.
Well, there's a reason young men pay a lot of car insurance, is because it's not a coincidence. They crash more. It's no one's trying to get at young men. They crash their cars because they drive too fast and they drive drunk and they do stupid things.
Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I think it's a really good point. Maybe there was a little part of the back of Achilles' mind thinking, yeah, but I'm not really going to die, am I? I'm Achilles. I'll
Yeah,
find a
right.
way. I'll get around it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so maybe we should move on to the House of Atreus, to the Tragedians, um, and yeah, talk about them. It's interesting because our recent Classical Wisdom literary magazine was dedicated to the House of Atreus, and our
Ah,
featured column was about Clytemnestra, written by Mary Naples, and in which you can't really justify Clytemnestra's actions, but you can give her a little bit of a broader light. And
yeah.
I thought that was very interesting because, you know, Clytemnestra is depicted as this horrible, horrible person, but her actions are a little bit more understandable if you know more of her history.
Mm,
And, I think a key point is Agamemnon, tricking her and her daughter, uh, and then murdering her,
yeah.
which, sucks.
I mean, you, you, I think you'd be cross with your husband if he did that.
Well, also, and I hadn't realized this, but didn't Agamemnon murder Clytemnestra's first husband and child as well?
I think you're right. Yes, I think. Oh, I
So
should take up my family tree. But he's, yeah. I mean, she's definitely. I remember. I can't remember who it was, but somebody basically said, pick any character from Greek mythology, and a good lawyer would get them off, because almost everybody has a mixed bag, and Clytemnestra definitely has some justice on her side. But the problem is a bit like what we were talking about before with Helen, is that yes, you have justice on your side, so you are required to avenge something bad that's happened. In this case, her husband's sacrificed her daughter and his daughter, and completely in cold blood, and she
yeah,
actually tricked them both into it. So she says, if you come to Aulis, you get to marry Achilles, you get to marry the greatest of the Greeks, and instead of marrying the greatest of the Greeks, she's sacrificed.
yeah,
Yeah, so it's a just dreadful, despicable trick. But like this lawyer working for all these Greek characters, Agamemnon might be able to get off, because he is in a bind as well, because he's got the whole Greek army there. They're all about to mutiny. He's got to get to Troy. He has sworn a sacred oath to go to Troy. So it's everybody's in a bind, and nobody's got a good way out. It's generally thought that whatever pressure on Agamemnon, you still shouldn't sacrifice your own daughter.
couldn't you have
With
sacrificed like a pig or something? I don't know.
it was
Or a peasant?
the demands of the gods, unfortunately, to send the winds. A peasant wouldn't have done it. No, that's no good. You need a princess, and it's used as an example of how badly everything goes after this. Is one of the reasons that the Greeks said, this is why we don't do human sacrifice. This is why we do animal sacrifice instead of the person, because human sacrifice, it just creates problems, and it creates a blood debt that needs to be paid. So Clytemnestra needs to repay this blood debt. So she does it by murdering Agamemnon, and then their children, their surviving children, need to repay that blood debt. So they kill Clytemnestra, and then somebody needs to kill Orestes, and there's no one left to kill Orestes, so he's pursued by the Fates, by the Furies. Yeah. So he's so this is on and on and on, and the blood debt only ends when Orestes, in the last book of in the Eumenides, in the last book of Aeschylus's trilogy about the cursed house of Atreus, he gets to Athens and he goes on trial, and this is a split decision in the jury. It's 6-6, and Athena gives the casting vote and saying, okay, so he's done a really bad thing. He needed to avenge this blood debt, but we can't ignore the sin of having done that. So it's a real damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of thing. I was going to say, the idea Clytemnestra doesn't really get a fair run. I don't think it's a bit like Helen sometimes. Like you were saying, Helen didn't really have a choice in all this stuff that happened to her. Clytemnestra is so justified in what she's doing. The problem where she loses her justification isn't that she murders her husband; it's that she's shacked up with his cousin, shacked up with Aegisthus. So she's being unfaithful, and you say, well, why shouldn't she be unfaithful? Because her husband's done this, but she's also diddling her son Orestes out of his birthright, which will be the kingdom. So this is what taints her in this situation. So probably if she hadn't gone with Aegisthus, she'd be a much more sympathetic character for the Greeks, I think.
Yeah, I guess that if she's not only it's a blood justice thing, but she's being a bad wife, but she's also being a bad mother, which then, even in our society, we would be like, oh, now you've gone too far. So speaking of like all these horrible things that they do, and like, just about every single taboo that you could possibly imagine is written about by the tragedians. Especially, Euripides always takes things too far. But every single side, there's infanticide, there's suicide, there's matricide, there's fratricide, there's regicide. I mean, everybody's awful at some point or another. what, so for our modern audiences, we're like, ooh, like that's like a lot. And what can we
Mm.
learn by studying these like horrible people who are doing horrible things all the time? So the question is, well, one, what value is that to us as modern people? And two, in the ancient Greek world, would they have thought they were as taboo as we do now, or were the actions a little less edgy?
Well, the some of the taboos would have been very differently calibrated. So Medea is one where we can think the taboo for us and for the Greeks is a mother murdering her children is a
Yeah,
huge
which is,
taboo.
yeah,
Yeah, it's this is
still, I
why.
mean,
I mean, yeah, I mean it's interesting to think why this lost. This play, which Odysseus put on, of course, at the Dionysia, the theatre competition in Athens, it was a competition, and you could win, you could lose, and Euripides lost that year. And the most of the thought is that he lost because this was just too much for the audience to take. But something which would have shocked them, which doesn't shock us, is also that Medea is a woman in control of men, and she's a foreign woman in control of Greek men. So
mhm.
she is being the ultimate manipulator. She's winning. She wins at the end of the Medea, and she is the only example of infanticide where there's no retribution for the culprit. So she's so that would have sickened the Greeks. We don't get sickened by the fact that this is a woman doing it and this is a foreigner doing it. What echoes through the ages is the brutal murder of the children, of course, and
Mm.
also Jason's behavior echoes through the ages as being awful as well, because abandoning his wife and running off with the new one to try to get himself a kingdom, to try and get a good job, basically.
It's interesting because our appetite for violence or the ability to, you know, withstand it is something that doesn't move in a straight line either. And I
Mm.
remember I was at the theater around the Shakespeare, the Globe, and I
Mm.
watched Titus Andronicus, which is a Shakespeare play with very
Oh yes,
classical themes. Uh, and there were warnings everywhere, and there were people ready to take care of people fainting in the audience because there was a
really,
particularly brutal rape murder scene,
yes.
which was horrific. And it's interesting because when Shakespeare wrote it, the audience was okay with watching that amount of violence. And then, of course, that play went out of fashion for hundreds of years because it was too violent,
Mm.
until our modern era, in which somebody thought we could handle this level of violence again because everybody's been watching like The Sopranos, and we're like, okay, yeah, it's normal. Um, and so I guess it's interesting to think about for the ancient Greeks, how much level of violence they were okay with, and that if some of these plays would not have been performed at different time periods because they would have been considered too horrific or too violent,
Mm.
too
Well,
taboo.
of course, famously, there's when people are killed in Greek theatre, it's almost always off stage. There's only one example we know of where there is a death on stage, and that's the suicide of Ajax when he comes out and falls on his sword. But almost always, everybody is killed off stage, and they're wheeled. There's a sort of trolley, the echikleia, that they wheel onto the stage with the dead body, and they present it, and it works very well dramatically. You present the dead body. Um, in terms of why they wanted the murders to take place off stage, there might be just a very simple sort of logistical reason, which is that we think about theatre in the way we see theatre, but in Greek theatre is very, very different. People are, for a start, there could be 15,000 people in the auditorium,
Well,
huge auditorium. So you can't do sort of very intricate little scenes where you probably, if somebody's being very intimately violent with somebody, it might not come across. People are wearing quite outlandish costumes. People are wearing masks with probably little funnels to help project their voice throughout this auditorium. So if you attempted to do some sort of very intimate, violent scene, it might just not look very good. It might not look very realistic on the stage. But in terms of what they were comfortable with, I mean, the Greeks, almost everybody watching that play would have killed somebody, probably, because most of them would have been a soldier at some point.
Yeah.
So death was not an uncommon thing, and if we're talking about the 5th century Athenians, they'd also lived through a plague, which makes our current situation look very, very mild. The Great Plague of Athens. So death and violent death were a common thing for the Athenian audience. So
would the audience have included women and children and non-soldiers?
Well, that's a really, it's a point that is still debated whether women certainly were allowed into the theatre at some point, but it's not really clear when. I think the prevailing idea is that probably they were not allowed in yet in the 5th century when all these plays are being written. So it might be in the 4th century, but you can pick up 4 books on this topic, and they'll have experts will give a different analysis to it. So it's hard to tell. Some people think that maybe they were allowed into tragedy but not comedy, maybe comedy but not tragedy. Yeah. So it's really difficult to tell whether women would have been allowed to see these plays live. It would be interesting to know, because it might change the way you look at them slightly.
Well, and the thing is that even if you're not a soldier, women too would have had more exposure to just death. When you think of like infant and maternal death rates, that would have just been so much more common, and women would have been more present. And speaking as somebody who did almost die in childbirth, it's pretty grisly.
Yes.
So I mean, they would have had that experience as well. You wouldn't just find death on the battlefield.
Well, that's a line from Medea, actually. Said, I would rather stand 3 times on the front line as a hoplite, as a soldier, than bear 1 child. So she talks about not the physical horror, but also the emotional difficulty and strain of being a mother. So Medea brings this up. This might be another reason it didn't win the competition, is because a lot of men in the audience said, "What's this woman talking about?"
Yeah. What we do is more dangerous, please.
Yeah, so someone telling all the men in the audience, that war you just fought? Yeah, that's not such a big deal.
Now, why would Euripides write so glowingly for women? I mean, he's often considered a bit of a misogynist, or yeah. I mean, why? And I mean, his imagery of riding alone in a cave, like kind of a madman. Why? What would been his motivation to be so sympathetic from the female's perspective, or to even want to write from the female's perspective?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said why was he so sympathetic, because I agree that he is very, very sympathetic. His female characters are more intelligent, they have more agency, they're more complex, they're more interesting than a lot of his male characters. The idea, you might pick up a book or an article that's talking about Euripides being a misogynist, and that was mostly accusations within his own lifetime that he was a misogynist, and this is mostly because he had 2 wives and they both were unfaithful to him, and they had 2 unsuccessful marriages, and it's just jokes, mostly from jokes in Aristophanes. It's not really clear how he was as a person. The image of him being, crouched over his papyrus, sitting in a cave on his own. I mean, he was from Salamis, which is where the cave of Euripides is, and some people think it's sort of an after the fact thing, and it was like a tourist site from Roman times. There's a piece of pottery found in the cave which said Euripides on the side of it, but it seems that the style of the writing is more from the Roman era. So it was like a pilgrimage site for people who really liked
A
Euripides.
souvenir shop that I mean, because they did sell souvenirs. Like that's, I mean,
Oh
the same thing. Like I'm sure you saw, like in Pompeii, they found like a fast food
yeah,
stall
yeah,
in Pompeii. But like a lot of times we know that like those big statues, the most famous ones of like Zeus, Olympius, and Athena, they would sell little trinkets outside of them,
yeah.
and that's how we know what they look like, because those trinkets survive. So it's like, why people would just go and see Euripides's cave and buy like a Euripides pen or something,
Oh, perhaps,
Euripides
yeah.
snow globe, I don't know, equivalent.
They're probably empty in Greece, but
Yeah, a Euripides
but yeah,
stuffy. Yeah.
yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. There was all there was this great merchandising of things. It's sort of, when you think about it for a few seconds, you sort of think, well, really, they had like miniatures like we have under the Eiffel Tower, and then you think again, you think, well, why wouldn't they? Of course they
I
would.
mean,
It's
yeah, people like traveling and getting souvenirs. I mean, that's not like
mm,
unique to the modern era. I mean, we just get to go further, but
yeah,
like,
we did.
yeah, I mean, yeah. Hey, last week I literally went to the end of the world. You know what I mean?
And back.
Yeah,
You're in an elite group. There's you, there's
yeah,
Odysseus, there's
yeah,
Heracles.
yeah. I was thinking of Dinakia actually, like looking at the penguins and being like, this is kind of equivalent. I mean, I'm gonna call that penguin Achilles, that one Agamemnon.
Yeah, absolutely. Didn't feed them a
Oh,
cocktail of barley and blood though, which is
I
which is
might have
what you
gotten
have
in
to do.
trouble for that. Yeah,
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 there's probably a sign up. Do not feed the penguins barley and blood.
yeah.
So Euripides, on his portrayal, why was he so concerned about the way he portrayed women? I mean, I don't know. It would be really interesting to find something out about this, but it seemed like Aristophanes also lampoons his mother. He makes fun of his mother for being a. He says she sold vegetables in the agora. Probably wasn't there. She probably owned some sort of business that did that, but she seemed like an important person, so perhaps she had a big influence on his life. But he's just I don't know, he's just a curious guy, and very thoughtful, very sympathetic. I could never really understand any arguments of people talking about him being a misogynist, because it's all the way through. His female characters are, when they're bad, they're very powerful and very smart, and when they're not bad, they're usually very sympathetic. Like Alcestis is a good example of, she says, I will die in place of my husband. My husband has been granted the chance to live forever if you can find somebody to die for him. And he couldn't find anybody, so she agreed to do it.
Mm.
So there's a huge amount of sympathy for female characters, and when they're bad, they're ferocious and fantastic and powerful and brilliant. So it would be nice to know where this came from Euripides' mind. But it is interesting that he was the least successful of the playwrights we have, of the three playwrights. He was least
Mm.
successful in his own time, and perhaps this could be one reason, because he keeps telling men in Athens who are about to vote on who's going to win the first prize. He keeps telling them that these women are smarter than men, or these women are more noble than men, or these men are all crummy. So
Maybe women were in the audience, they were able to vote too. And that's how we know that the women were there. He's appealing
well,
to the
we this is interesting about this is not, sorry, this is a bit of a segue, but the voting system. There
I was
would be
going to ask about that. Yeah, because I don't know anything about the voting system.
well, the voting system, there will be 10 judges who vote for the plays. The plays, you've got days of plays, because you've got Monday, we've got Aristophanes puts on, sorry, Euripides puts on 4 plays. So he does every time he puts on plays, it's a trilogy. So there will be Medea, and then this play, and then this play, and then the 4th play would be a sort of satire play, it was called, which is kind of like a Benny Hill sort of thing. It's kind of something to depressurize after 3 tragedies back to back. And so the next day you've got Sophocles, and he puts on 3 tragedies, and then he has his satire play. And whoever's competing that year, you have the 3 tragedians, the 3 days, and then you've got the voting, and you've got the 10 judges who vote. And to avoid corruption, the judges all put their votes in a jar, and they picked out only 5 votes. So even if you got to a judge and you bribed him, you had no guarantee his vote would be taken out of the jar. So it was a really good way of trying to, if you're going to bribe them, you had to bribe everybody.
But then it's very random too, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the other. I mean, this is perhaps a reason when people say, how could Euripides, how could Medea come third? It's widely thought to be the best of the surviving plays. Some people think it's usually the Bacchae or Medea are the 2 which are thought to be the best of all the plays that have survived. And say, how could it come third? Well, it could come third because of this taking 5 random votes out of the judging jar. It could be because the Medea was great, but the other 2 plays he put on were lousy. Because you have to put on 3. It could have been because the satire play, the little comedy at the end he put on, wasn't very good. Because he was so experimental. Euripides, Alcestis, I just mentioned, was supposed to be a sort of satire play, but it's got features. It's not a traditional satire play. It doesn't really have this comic ring to it. It's a bit too serious. So, and the other thing about what might make somebody win first prize, second prize, or third prize would be, you've got your choreogos, who's the person who pays the money for your production, and that's randomly assigned to you. So if you've got a cheap choreogos, then you're not going to have a very successful production. So if you've got rich choreogoi for the other productions, they're going to give you lots of money for nice costumes, for better actors. And it might also be because they were accompanied by music. And this might account for Sophocles' amazing success. Sophocles really, he had 90 plays, and he was really the darling sorry, not 90. No, that was Euripides. 120 plays Sophocles had, and he was really the darling of the Greek theatre. And one of the reasons he was so successful in his own time, Euripides is more successful for us, more has survived Euripides, but in his own time, Sophocles might have won so many first prizes because apparently he was a great musician, and he also wrote the music for his plays. So it might have been the all-round spectacle was just better for Sophocles, and maybe Euripides, he produced these little gems. So Medea was brilliant, and then maybe the rest of the day wasn't so good. So it's...
Yeah, I was going to actually bring that up because we've been doing a lot of stuff recently on music. And actually this month's podcast is on ancient music. And it's something I think that we often forget is that these plays are all musicals, that there's music happening throughout all of them, because we don't really think about music as much when we're reading the text. Obviously, we don't even know how much the music sounded like, but that even the language was more musical, that there would have been a beat throughout the whole thing, that this, the sense of music is a really important part. And I mean, we even think now, we just think of these things as dramas. Like, we don't necessarily like put music to it. And we should have. When we did Philoctetes 20 years ago, we should have put music to it. That would have been cool.
That would have made it even more difficult if I had to attempt any singing when I was trying to be Philoctetes on stage.
Well, because we don't really have like musical tragedies. That's not really like, well, Les Mis, I guess. Perfect example of a musical tragedy.
But even in Shakespeare's time, there was probably some sort of a musical accompaniment, and there was certainly, they didn't have satire plays exactly, but at the end they would bring on a comedian, they would bring on somebody to do a few tumbles, they bring on a fool. So you got Hamlet's just killed everybody, and then on comes the jester to jump around and do a little dance and cheer everybody up.
Yeah. Can you imagine though if they did that like at the end of a Scorsese film or something like that? There's like 5 minutes of like Mr. Bean or something. I would, maybe we should try to bring back that format, though. I wonder if more people would get into it, or nowadays we're just so much more serious.
Hmm. I don't know. Well, I was actually thinking about this today, about giving the prizes as well, about why Euripides might have finished, Medea might have finished third. And like I say, it could be that it was too shocking. It could be all the other reasons I just talked about. I think probably if you could attach like a serotonin meter to me, it would have probably been higher at movies that I don't really value that much in my mind. If I finished a movie, probably when I was happiest, it was when I just seen, I don't know, Toy Story or Four Weddings and a Funeral or something. But when I think about what's a really, really, really good movie, I think, I don't know, Requiem
Schindler's
for a
List.
Dream. That was a great movie. Schindler's List. That was a great movie, but I didn't come bouncing out of the theater after I'd seen them.
No. Yeah, you're not
So,
like, woohoo, train spotting.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess it's just a different experience too. But I think
Hmm.
we should recreate these a bit more, just I think to see how the experience of theater is, because nowadays theater is not as well. Obviously, with the pandemic, theater is not doing very well at all. I mean,
Not very
I
well, no.
hope this isn't a bit of a death knell to the theatrical industry,
Yeah.
but it's interesting too, because theater is kind of considered high art. It's kind of considered with more gravitas, whereas and our lack of gravitas is, like HBO series, or even HBO series are now getting more gravitas.
Yeah.
But that it's just interesting to think that in the ancient Greek world, theater wouldn't have been like so exclusive. I mean, I don't
Oh,
think it would
no.
have been considered like just for the high classes. If anything, especially archaic Greece is very community based. It's just part of society. Like everybody went to the theater.
In fact, it was the tickets were made free at one point. It might have been under Pericles, I think. And there was a law in ancient Athens saying you can't spend more on the army than you can on theatre in peacetime. And it was a law that
Awesome.
if you broke it, it was punishable by death if you tried to break this law. If you were in the parliament and you suggested we should spend more money on the army and you were not at war, that was actually a death sentence you could have handed down
See,
on you, saying, "No,
this is
we don't spend more on the arts."
this is why we need classics, so people can learn things like this and
Yeah,
think about how we could improve our own societies, if only is to spend as much on the arts as it is the military. What a world we would live in.
yeah, yeah, that'd be pretty good. That'd be
That
good.
might be a
We
good.
might we
What's
might get
that?
invaded, but it would be,
Well,
but we'd have great theatre.
now, but just okay, and we should probably finish up, so because you've already been so gracious with your time, but just to say the value of theater, when you think at the end of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta did not take down Athens' walls and destroy Athens because her theater and arts had been so great that
Mm.
even the Spartans, a military obsessed society, felt that for humanity and society, you should not destroy Athens.
Yeah, that was really wonderful, gracious move at the end of the war from the Spartans. This there's a modern equivalent of, during the Second World War, Churchill is being told that he has to cut funding to the arts, and he replied to his minister, "Then what are we fighting for?"
Yeah,
So
yeah, yes. So yes, maybe the arts can save you in the end.
let's hope so.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.